Okay, so we're going to look at slides 29 through 40, which is the stomach. A lot of people think the stomach is the end-all be-all of the digestive system, but it's really not. It's the star. But we're going to find out the small intestines, which we've talked about, is a much bigger part of what's going on. But let's look at the stomach. So the stomach is a J-shaped pouch. It is really, what it is this long alimentary canal, this long tube. This is just an expanded little pouch, and it's going to have what we call sphincters, little round muscles on either side of it that allow it to hold onto food. So if we come upon a buffet, we can really pig out but not overwhelm our system, because we'll see how the stomach actually will limit the rate at how much goes into the small intestines in order so the small intestines are used to break it down. So it's inferior to the diaphragm. It's just underneath the diaphragm on the upper left portion of the abdominal pelvic cavity. It would be in that upper left quadrant if we were dividing it in quadrants. And the main part of it would be the upper left hypochondriac area. So those are the two areas where it would be. It's the opposite of the liver, which is on the upper right. So when we look at it on the inside, there's going to be these folds called rugae, and we'll talk about those soon. They're just there to allow the stomach to expand, as it says here, for distension. So it allows the stomach to expand and hold food. Now the stomach receives food from the esophagus. Now remember, we called the food that was coming into the esophagus, we called that a bolus. I don't know if I can trying to learn how to use this. Probably not going to be spelling things out like that too much. Let me erase that. That looks awful. So anyway, it was called a bolus, and as that comes down, it's going to mix in with gastric juice. We're going to start seeing that it's called something else after that time. But this gastric juice is going to have a lot of stuff in it. Well, I shouldn't say a lot. It's going to have several chemicals in it. They're going to start the process of breaking down many, many things. Protein is the kind of the main one, because the pH is going to, if you remember, what we call denature that protein, which is basically unwind it to try and get it to where it can start getting broken down into smaller parts. There's very few things that get absorbed in the stomach. We'll look at those, a few of them, water being the main one, but this is what's going to be the stopping point to the small intestines. This is what's going to kind of regulate how much and how fast the food enters in there. The stomach is the only area in the digestive tract that has three layers to the muscularis. Remember, there were 4 layers in total. You had the mucosa and the submucosa, and then you had the muscularis, and then the serosa, the muscularis being generally the two main muscles, was an inner circular muscle and an outer longitudinal muscle. These provided the ability to do things like segmentation, where we mix things up, or also just moving forward. We call it peristalsis. But in the stomach, there's a third layer, and it's generally called an oblique layer because the fibers run at an angle. And so as these fibers run, and they allow for the stomach to twist more, and to see, the stomach's kind of like a cement mixer for the body. It's trying to get things all broken down a little bit more, but mixed thoroughly with stuff. The next slides are going to kind of go into more in depth on this. So this is looking at the inside of the stomach. This is something that's will be pretty big in lab, but you're going to have a greater curvature and a lesser curvature on the stomach, which is pretty obvious, which is generally just the inside and the outside curve. You're going to have a sphincter. We have the lower esophageal sphincter at the very top part, right? Kind of right in this little area. And then we have what we call the pyloric sphincter, which is down at this area. And so those two are going to kind of keep protection and keep this pouch sealed. Right? Now, there's going to be a couple different places in this pouch. I'm going to actually erase some of this stuff that I had on here. Let's see, that was kind of weird, but I got it down. And so I'm going to have an area that's a little bubble area. We call this the fundus. I'm going to have a very small entryway where the stuff that is coming in is going to enter in. And this is called the cardia. And again, sometimes it's called the cardiac. There's an area where you're going to see the stomach kind of narrow down. This is a big part called the pylorus, right? And it's the end way. Now, all of this stuff in here, right? All of this in this area, that's going to be the area that we call the body, right? So the body's the majority of things, and so as food comes in, it's going to be closed off at the cardia and closed off at the pyloric sphincter, or at the lower esophageal sphincter and the pyloric sphincter. And then the food that's in there is going to start getting rumbled around where the three layers of muscles are going to kind of massage it. And we're going to show you some of the chemicals that are going to be dumped into it to kind of help this part of the digestion. Now, one other thing I want to point out, these folds that are in here, all these little wrinkles that you see, all of these are what we sometimes call gastric folds, but they are, for us, more specifically called rugae. And all they are is little, if you can imagine a curtain, like an old movie theater or theater that has a curtain that covers the stage. When it's covering the stage, it's all kind of stretched tight, but as you pull it back, you'll have these braids, these ridges, these folds that occur because it's being pushed back so it can stretch later. That's what rugae are. They're simply folds in the inner lining so that it can have the ability. This is simply a picture, a radiograph. Sorry, that was very. That was way too geekish. This is an X-ray, and they've shown some stuff that they've swallowed, I believe, barium on this probably to show up certain areas. This isn't the best. Hopefully, if you've ever seen X-rays, the fundus is something that shows up fairly easily. It's going to be a little darkened on most X-rays, spot at the very top of the stomach, and what's usually a gas bubble. So anyway, don't worry about this picture. It's not going to be on your test. But this will, all right, this is talking about the different substances that our stomach is going to secrete and put into the food that's been swallowed. And again, we're going to learn as this gets mixed in, that bolus that we swallowed will now be called chyme. All right, so first and foremost, is this thing called pepsinogen. All right? Pepsinogen is secreted by chief cells. You have to know that. Pepsinogen is secreted by chief cells. I told you a long time ago I had a professor that gave us a little cartoon drawing of an Indian chief with a can of Pepsi on his knee, and they said that Chief Pepsi was the caption underneath it. So I could always remember chief cells could produce pepsin or pepsinogen, which we'll talk about why it's pepsinogen first. But I do want you to know chief cells produce this. Now, pepsinogen, if you remember, and when we were looking at in the blood, and we talked about this suffix, this ending, OGEN. We talked about what that means is it's a precursor to something. And so like fibrinogen was a precursor to fibrin. Well, pepsinogen is a precursor or an inactive form of this stuff called pepsin. All right? Pepsin is an enzyme that's used to break down proteins. Now remember, the bonds or proteins are made up of amino acids. This is really important for you to remember. Amino acids form these long chains, and they call these long chains proteins. Now, a long chain can also be called a polypeptide. It is a protein once this long chain becomes all twisted into this unique characteristic. If you remember back in 210, we talked about it as the tertiary form of what the protein looked like. So pepsin is designed to kind of unravel that protein and make it into long chains of amino acids that we can start breaking down. But if I've got a substance that's designed to break down proteins, and proteins are used to encase it to store, I can't store it in its active form. If I stored pepsin as an active enzyme, it would eat through the container. So we store it as this pepsinogen, right? So it is an inactive form. So basically it's kind of a long chain. It gets released by the chief cells. And then when it gets into the inside of the stomach, it's going to come in contact with this substance called hydrochloric acid. And hydrochloric acid converts pepsinogen into pepsin. All right. And then once pepsin is in there, it starts breaking down these long chains. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. I'm going to go through it again. I'm not trying to overwhelm with the little eraser here or the arrow. I'm just trying to help guide you through it. So I have these things called chief cells. They're going to secrete this substance called pepsin, which is an inactive form, or pepsinogen, which is an inactive form of pepsin. Right? So now pepsin is going to help break down proteins. Right? All right. Now, what breaks down pepsinogen into pepsin is this substance called hydrochloric acid. And hydrochloric acid is secreted by parietal cells. Now, one way you can remember this, parietal, we've already talked about a couple of things that are parietal. If you remember when we were talking about membranes, you had a visceral and parietal membrane. We're talking about the cranial cavity. Two of the big bones were parietal bones. Two of the large lobes of the brain were parietal lobes. Parietal kind of means a covering, an outer part. So I've got a lot of cells that form in the stomach that are forming the majority of what we call the stomach. And they're called parietal cells. And their job is to secrete hydrochloric acid. And hydrochloric acid helps convert pepsinogen into pepsin. So I hope you're following the cycle there. Another thing that's going to be produced here is something called gastric, which is telling you it's coming from the stomach, and lipase. And we talked about ASE. ASE means it's an enzyme. So gastric lipase is an enzyme that is going to be produced by the stomach, gastric, and it is going to work on lipids because it is the name of it, lipid, lipase. All right. So again, hope that this is making sense. I'm trying my best. Now, the second to last one is pretty easy to kind of figure out. If we're talking about a mucus cell, I hope that you can tell me that it's going to secrete mucus. So mucus cells and mucus, I think I said that backwards, but that's fine. Mucus cells and mucus should be synonymous in your brain. And then the last one is called intrinsic factor. In intrinsic factor, I told you a while ago, intrinsic factor is always about this B12. So for us in here, if you ever hear intrinsic factor, know that it is simply talking about vitamin B12. When you hear intrinsic factor, think vitamin B12. If you hear vitamin B12, think intrinsic factor. All right, I think that I did my best on that slide. On this slide, I'm not worried about too much. We're not really going over gastric pits and whatever, but I do want you to see the lining of the stomach. When we talk about the muscularis, again, this is the muscularis, and it's going to have 1, 2, 3 layers, right? So it's only in the stomach that there's going to be 3 layers. This is a pretty good breakdown of the stuff that we looked at that was secreted by the stomach. And remember, and I don't know that if I said this, I want you to remember this, that as a group, it's called gastric juice. Gastric juice is the collection of things that the stomach is producing. Now, there's going to be a lot of regulation that's going on here. You're going to have gastric juice that is constantly being produced, but sometimes it's at high levels, sometimes it's at low levels. And as it says here, that's what it means by the rate of production varies. And there's a lot of things that are controlling what it's going to be doing. We have sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system that is controlling it, helping to control it. That's the neural regulation. Remember, sympathetic, which is the fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system, one of the few things it really inhibits is going to be the GI tract, the digestive system. So sympathetic impulses decrease gastric activity, where parasympathetic, this guy right here, parasympathetic is called the rest and digest nervous system, and it is stimulatory to gastric activity. It's going to increase gastric activity and stimulate gastric secretion. In the hormonal regulation, we have somatostatin, which inhibits the hydrochloric acid secretion. Then we have what's called gastrin, this stuff right here, which we're going to see is going to increase gastric secretion. And then our famous cholecystokinin, CCK. This is going to be released by the small intestines, and it's got many jobs. But the thing that it does as far as gastric secretion is, it decreases gastric motility. It decreases the gastric secretions. So again, if you understand that it's coming from this thing, the small intestines, then you can hopefully figure out that what it's doing is the small intestines are going back and telling the stomach, hey, I'm done, or I'm working, don't send, take your time sending stuff to me. So anyway, hopefully that makes sense. So this is just showing how the parasympathetic is going to be sending the signals in. Remember that the parasympathetic uses the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, right, which is an X, right, cranial nerve 10. And in the parasympathetic, you do need to know that it has a long preganglionic fiber. You don't need to know it for this test, but you should be able to know that. It'll come up later on. So anyway, so it's going to secrete, it's going to cause a release to stimulate gastric juice. Now, in this secretion, there's several areas that control it. The cephalic, which is the head, the gastric, which is the stomach, and the intestinal, which is basically the small intestines. Right? Those are going to be 3 phases. Now, most of us can consciously think of times, or I should say, we can think of times where we consciously controlled our gastric secretions. In the cephalic phase, which is about the things, our taste, our smell, our sight, or just simply the thought of food. These are all things that are in our head. So if you've ever seen a key lime pie or something that's tart and you can feel your mouth kind of pucker up, that's it. Or if you're kind of hungry and you think about chips and salsa or something, and you start feeling your stomach, that's the cephalic phase. All right, so the things in our head, that's going to be the cephalic phase. Then we get to the gastric phase. So the food in the stomach, right, that's in the stomach is going to start causing a release of things like gastrin, which is going to cause more, it's going to cause a stimulation of the secretion of gastric juice. Man, that was tough to say. It's going to cause more gastric juice to be secreted. So it stretches, the gastrin's released, more gastric juice. And then we get to the intestinal phase. So once we start getting some food into the small intestines are going to send a signal back to the stomach that's going to help tell the stomach to slow down. It's going to inhibit gastric juice. So when the small intestine gets its first little bit, it's going to send a chemical signal back to the stomach to tell it to just hold up for a minute and let me work on the little bit you gave me, and then it'll send another signal. Now in the stomach, again, we're still talking about the stomach, we have pepsin that starts breaking down proteins. Now, again, these proteins will now be polypeptides, which just mean long chain. So it's just the first step of getting it unraveled. Now, the big thing here is the stomach itself does not absorb much. There's not much that gets across the lining of the stomach. Water can, but we're generally trying to put more water into the food at this point. We're trying to, because water's the key to most of the reactions that are going to happen. Certain salts, which just means ions, right? And like I should have kept to my thing. I can't I can't really spell or type out with this. Ions are electrolytes. Again, they're small little molecules. Some of them can get across. Lipids are also things that can get across. Remember, lipids can go through cell membranes. So some lipids can get through here. The very acidic internal environment plus the alkaline mucus that is lining the stomach that's trying to help prevent the damage to it, kind of limits it a little bit, but lipids can come across, and some alcohol. Now, I know nobody in here ever drank alcohol, but if you've ever heard of people doing this thing called a shot, they'll feel a warmth in their stomach, and that's the alcohol being absorbed. Now, again, I know none of y'all have ever done that. And then we get to the mixing. We're going to have, as this gets in, the stomach, because it has those three layers of the muscularis, can really twist and turn, and it's going to start mixing this food with the gastric juice. Now, it was called a bolus as it entered. Once it entered, it mixes in with the gastric juice, and then it is called chyme. All right. Now, as this happens, it's going to keep kind of mixing it in, and then small amounts get pushed into the area of the pylorus. Then the pylorus will actually start segmenting off little parts of it, as you can kind of see here. It's going to segment this little portion off, and then it's going to try to take it and then push that small portion into the duodenum. So the pyloric sphincter will relax and allow that little bit to go across. Now, once that happens, then we're going to have the intestinal reflexes that happen. We talked about the intestinal phase. It's going to release that CCK, which is going to go back to the stomach and then cause the stomach to kind of slow down and keep and kind of limit the things that are going to move through this little area. Now, finally, when we talk about the emptying actions, when it starts getting little pockets into the duodenum, the chyme is going to have a stretch factor to the duodenum in this area, and it's called the enterogastric stretch, and it's going to kind of slow down also this neural component that's bringing stuff in. This is why they say it's hard. Like if you eat too fast, you can overeat because you'll be full before you know it. And the reason that you don't know that you're full is this stretch hasn't happened to tell your brain that, hey, I'm full, so you'll keep eating. That's why if you're at a buffet, sometimes you have a tendency to feel really miserable after, because this enterogastric reflex hadn't happened yet. But that's what allows you to know that you are full. It's really basically saying, all right, let my stomach work on what I've got. Now we're in the intestinal phase. And I hope that that all made sense.